The sky over Dakota Territory on the morning of February 9th, 1884, was the color of old pewter. Flat, indifferent, the kind of sky that gives nothing away. Hollis Vane stood at the mouth of the cave with her arms folded across her wool coat and watched it. Behind her inside the limestone, 23 people were sleeping on bedrolls laid across a dry stone floor. A cast iron stove ticked softly in the cabin at the back of the cave. A chestnut gelding stood in the anteroom with his head low, breathing slow as if the world outside had nothing to do with him. The air in the cave held at 53 degrees, as it had held every day since before any living person had set foot in this territory. Outside, the air was 8 degrees below zero and falling. Hollis had been awake since before dawn. She had been awake most of the night. She had lit the oil lantern in the stone niche beside the cave mouth at 2 in the morning and at 4 and again, just now replacing each one before the flame guttered, so that any traveler within sight of the cliff would have at any hour a single small yellow eye to walk toward. She had built that niche in October. She had hung the brass bell on its iron hook in September. She had driven 63 cedar stakes from the edge of town to the foot of this cliff in the first week of November, in weather that was still mild enough to work without gloves against exactly the kind of morning this had turned out to be. She had done all of it before any storm was on the horizon, before any man in the town of Endeavor, Dakota Territory had thought to ask why. Most of them had not asked why. Most of them had simply laughed. That had been 7 months ago. 7 months that felt standing here now in the cold at the mouth of a cave that had just sheltered human lives through 7 days of the worst storm this country had ever produced, like a different life belonging to a different woman. She was 33 years old. She had built this place with her own hands and her husband's. She had filled it with enough food to last a winter and enough wool to warm a small army. She had done all of it for reasons she had never fully explained to anyone, including herself. That was not quite true. She knew the reason. She had known it since she was 11 years old, standing in the wreckage of a Vermont farmhouse on a February morning, very much like this one, holding a small wooden bird in her hand. She had just never said it out loud. Her shoulders moved once, twice, then they stopped. Her husband Asa appeared in the doorway of the cabin behind her. He watched her back for a moment, then said nothing, because he was a man who understood which silences belonged to other people. Hollis turned from the mouth of the cave and walked back inside. There were people she still had to take care of. Let us go back to the beginning, not to the storm. The storm is easy to understand. The storm was simply weather doing what weather in Dakota has always done, which is to arrive without apology and leave without explanation. Go back further. Go back to a Vermont farmhouse in the winter of 1862. Go back to a small girl kneeling on a plank floor with her cheek against the boards listening. Her name was Hollis. She was 11 years old. Her father was Calvin Vane, a stonemason from Montpelier who built foundations and root cellars and the careful dry-laid walls that kept Vermont farms from sliding off Vermont hillsides. He was a quiet man with large hands and the particular patience of someone who has spent his life working with materials that do not hurry. He had taught Hollis what he taught his apprentices, that a stone properly chosen and properly set was a kind of clock. It held heat. It gave heat back. A root cellar dug into a hillside in July stayed cool enough to keep cream from turning. The same cellar in February stayed warm enough that potatoes did not freeze. He called it the breath of the earth. He said the earth was always breathing slow and even, and a person who learned to listen to that breath did not need to fight the weather. They could ride it. What Calvin Vane had not built was the house they lived in. The house had been built before him by a man with thinner money and thinner timber, and it sat on the flat ground of the valley floor, the way a bad idea sits in an otherwise sensible mind, upright, stubborn, and wrong in ways that would not become fully apparent until it was too late. Hollis's sister Elsie was 4 years old. She was a small, serious child who liked to carve. She carved everything: spoon handles, door frames, once the leg of a kitchen chair, for which there had been a long, quiet conversation with their mother. Her favorite thing in the world was a small wooden bird their father had made for her 3rd birthday, no bigger than a child's fist. The wings folded close along the body, the eye burned in with the tip of a nail. On a February night in 1862, the wind found the corner of that house where the framing had gone soft, and it took the corner off the way a child takes the crust off a pie. The roof came down at an angle. Elsie had been asleep under the eaves. Hollis remembered and would remember for the rest of her life the particular sound that a wooden house makes when it is no longer a house. It is not a crash. It is not a bang. It is a long, slow groan, and then a silence so complete it sounds like an answer to a question you did not know you had asked. They found Elsie in the morning. She was still holding the bird. Calvin Vane built no more houses on bare ground after that. He dug in. He set his back to the prevailing wind and his face to the south. He built into hills, and when a neighbor asked why he had become strange about such things, he said only that the earth had taught him a lesson he was now paying tuition on for the rest of his life. Hollis learned the same lesson on the same night. She took the bird from her sister's hand, not as a keepsake, not as a comfort. She took it because it was the only physical evidence she had of a specific and irreversible mistake, and she intended to carry that evidence with her until she understood it well enough to make sure it never happened again. She kept it in a tin at the bottom of her cedar trunk, wrapped in a square of her mother's old apron. She took it out twice a year, once in February and once at the height of summer, and set it on whatever table was nearest, and looked at it for a few minutes and then put it back. She did not tell anyone about the bird. Not for 21 years. Not even Asa. She was 22 when she walked into the field office of the Northern Pacific Railroad in St. Paul with a letter of reference from a man who had worked her father's quarry. She wanted to carry chain on a survey crew. They told her women did not carry chain. She told them she did not require their permission to be a woman, only their permission to work. The foreman, who had a survey running 3 weeks behind schedule and a budget that could not absorb another delay, looked at her for a long moment. He made the calculation that a capable woman in a wool coat who came with a solid reference was cheaper than 3 more weeks of delay. He hired her. She worked 8 years for the Northern Pacific, from the lake country of Minnesota down across the Red River and out into the Dakota grass. In that time, she learned 3 things that mattered more than anything else she would ever be taught. The first came from a tunnel. The Northern Pacific cut a series of tunnels that summer through a ridge of dolomite in the western lake country. Hollis stood in those tunnels at noon in August, with the sweat drying on the back of her neck, because inside the rock it was 53 degrees, and outside the rock it was 91. She stood in the same tunnels in January snow against her boots, and inside it was 53 degrees again. Her father's breath of the earth made vast and literal. She put her hand on the tunnel wall and understood the way a person sometimes understands a thing all at once, after years of half-understanding, that the rock was not insulating against the cold. The rock was not insulating against the heat. The rock simply did not change. Everything around it changed, and the rock was what it was, as it had always been, as it would always be. 53 degrees. The number went into her the way certain numbers do, not as information, as a fact about the structure of the world. The second lesson came from 8 winters of watching snow. A survey crew reads land the way a sailor reads weather, by being wrong about it, until being wrong becomes expensive. Hollis learned which slopes shed water and which collected it. She learned where the prairie wind made its own roads, long, smooth roads, through certain notches between certain hills, and that anything you built on one of those roads was already half torn down. She learned to watch where snow lay deepest and where it had been swept bare, because the deepest snow was not where the wind was strongest. The deepest snow was where the wind stopped, where a hill or a ridge or a stand of cottonwood made the air slow down and release what it had been carrying. The wind did not bury things where it was powerful. It buried things where it rested. She filled 6 survey notebooks with observations over those 8 years. The notebooks were not required by the Northern Pacific. She kept them for herself. The third lesson came from a man named Fergus Laird. Laird was a geologist from Edinburgh who had come to Minnesota in 1867 to study the glacial formations of the lake country and had never quite gotten around to going home. He was 60-something with a white beard and the deliberate speech of a man who had learned to say exactly what he meant and had made a discipline of it. Hollis met him at a surveyor's dinner in St. Paul in the winter of 1875 and spent the next 4 months walking the outcrops of the river valley with him on Sunday mornings, learning to read stone the way he read it, not as obstacle or resource, but as record. Stone remembers, he told her, every crack and fold and color change is a sentence in a very long book. Most people walk past it their whole lives and never learn to read. He taught her to look at the angle of a fault line and understand which direction the land had been under pressure. He taught her to read the moisture content of limestone by its color in different lights. He taught her that a cave in a south-facing limestone cliff, if the geology was right, could hold a temperature so stable that the seasons became theoretical. She thought about Elsie when he said that. She thought about the bird. She did not say so. She met Asa in St. Paul in the back room of a furniture shop where she had gone to ask about a particular kind of mortise and tenon joinery. He was the one who answered. He was the son of a Pennsylvania timber frame builder, raised on the long, quiet patience of Greenwood, and the understanding that a joint either fits or it does not, and there is no useful argument to be made with a joint that does not fit. He did not say very much. He listened well. Over the course of 2 evenings and one long Sunday walk, she described to him the kind of house she intended to build one day. A house set into stone. A house that used the earth's own temperature as its foundation. A house with walls that held warmth, the way a held hand holds warmth, not by generating heat, but by refusing to give it up. He did not laugh. He did not flatter her. He did not ask if she was sure. He asked where. They were married within the year. They saved for 2 more. In the spring of 1883, with a wagon, a horse, a chest of tools, and a sealed envelope of banknotes carried against her ribs. Hollis Vane crossed into Dakota Territory, looking for a specific kind of cliff. She found it on the second day of riding the country north of a small town called Endeavor, and she sat on her horse for a long time at the foot of it before she got down because she wanted to be certain before she moved. The opening in the limestone was 40 feet wide at the mouth and 25 feet high, narrowing as it went back into the rock until at 60 feet deep, it was 30 feet wide, and the ceiling came down to about 15. The floor was dry. The walls were dry. South-facing, sheltered from the prevailing northwest wind by the curve of the cliff. A natural fissure running up through the ceiling toward daylight, which she noted with a quiet private satisfaction, because a fissure could be made to vent a stove. She was still walking the sage at the foot of the cliff, planning where the corral would go, when she found the other thing. She nearly stepped on it, a line of charred timbers half buried, the iron bands of a stove laid on its side in the grass. A tin cup so weathered the seam had failed. 20 paces further, a low rectangle of fieldstone that had once been a foundation. And beyond that, almost hidden in the sage, a single rough headstone. The name on the stone had worn away. The date had not. 1872. The bones of a homestead. Sitting in plain sight of the cliff she intended to live in. Sitting in plain sight of the town she intended to live near. Apparently invisible to both. She did not mention it that evening. She thought about it for 3 days. Then she rode into town and asked a question casually at the feed store of an old man who sat on a barrel by the stove and appeared to have made a career of knowing things. There had been a family, he said, came out from Ohio 12 or so years back, set themselves up on that flat below the North Cliff. Built nice, had a good first summer. The winter of 72 was the winter of 72, and there had not been much of them by spring. Most of the town didn't talk about it. Most of the town, he added with a small dry shrug, had not been the town yet. Most had come after the rail talk started in 76. And to those people, the bottomland was just bottomland. He paused, added almost to himself that Mayor Pell knew. Pell had been here. Pell didn't like the story told. Hollis thanked him for the oats she'd come to buy. She rode home along the creek slowly. She changed 3 things in her plan that week. She raised the cabin floor higher. She doubled the wool she planned to put in the walls. And she began, even before ground was broken, to lay in more food than 2 people could possibly need in a winter. She did not explain why to anyone. Not yet. The land office of Endeavor occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on the main street, where the afternoon heat collected under the tin roof and pressed down on everyone who came in until they signed something just to leave. Mayor Aldrich Pell was a soft, round man in his middle 50s with a thin smile and a memory he had learned to edit. He had been the mayor of Endeavor for 9 years, and he wore that tenure the way a man wears a coat that no longer quite fits a wear of it, slightly uncomfortable, unwilling to take it off. He looked over the rim of his spectacles at the woman across his desk and found himself, as he always did, when she looked directly at him, talking more than he intended. "You can have any quarter section south of the creek," he said. "Black loam 2 feet down. A man could put a plow in there, and the plow would do the thinking for him." His thumb hovered over the bottomland on the hand-drawn map over the square that was the color of a good steak over the ground that was rich and flat and easy. And situated, though he did not say this, precisely where the family from Ohio had built their house in 1871. Hollis did not look at the bottomland. Her finger scarred along the second knuckle from 8 years of holding a surveyor's chain in country that did not want to be measured came down on a piece of broken ground 3 miles north of town. A cliff of weathered limestone, a sage flat at its foot, a gap in the rock face that on the survey map appeared as a small, careless smudge. That one. Pell's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again with the patient cheer of a man explaining to a child that fire is hot. Mrs. Vane, that is worthless ground. You cannot plow it. You can barely graze it. There is a hole the size of a barn in the side of it. That hole is why I want it. He leaned back. The chair complained. He looked at her, then at Asa, who had not said anything, and did not appear inclined to start. Asa was a long, narrow man with careful hands and the steady half-smile of a husband who has already had this conversation several times in a wagon by lamplight. You mean to live in a cave? I mean to live in a cabin inside a cave, Mayor. It is 1883, Mrs. Vane. We have lumber. We have glass. We have a mill and a siding planer not 40 miles from here. We are not building a town for people who choose to live. Like he paused, searching for a word that was not quite the word he meant, like it's an earlier time. A frame house, a glass window, built inside the cliff. He stared at her. He looked at Asa for help. Asa, finding none required of him, offered the smallest nod a husband can offer, confirming his wife in the eyes of a witness without making any noise about it. Pell shook his head. He did it the way a man shakes water from his hat. That is the most damn fool thing I have heard in a long career of hearing damn fool things. But that is your quarter section to ruin. The pen scratched. The seal came down with the sound of a small door closing. Hollis took the deed, folded it once along the grain, and slid it inside the inner pocket of her wool jacket against her ribs, where she kept all the documents she did not intend to let out of her sight. Outside in the white July light, she crossed the street to the wagon. Asa helped her up. As the wagon rolled past the open door of the saloon, a man inside laughed once. Not at her specifically, not yet, but in her general direction, as if rehearsing. They drove north toward the cliff in silence for a mile. Then she looked at her husband and said quietly, "They have not seen what we have seen." Asa watched the road. "No," he said. "They will." The man who named it was Cyrus Mott. Mott was the largest cattle rancher in the county, a wide, red-faced man in his late 40s who wore a silver-trimmed saddle on a black stallion he had bought specifically because it looked good under a silver-trimmed saddle. He had opinions about most things, and the volume to ensure those opinions reached everyone in a room simultaneously. He rode out to the cliff one bright August morning with the air of a magistrate visiting a curious case, and he sat his horse at the edge of the sage for 10 full minutes, watching Hollis and Asa clear loose stone from the cave floor before he spoke. "That's a fine hole, Mrs. Vane." "It is. I have a barn going up at my home place. Cost me $3,000. White oak frame, best timber in the territory, joined by a man out of Minneapolis. That's a fine barn, Mr. Mott. I'm trying to picture how a person comes to think a hole in a rock is better than a $3,000 barn." Hollis leaned on the long-handled shovel. She looked at him the way she would have looked at a section line that did not quite close, with a kind of patient interest in the error. "Time will tell, Mr. Mott." He smiled the smile of a man who has already won the argument in his own mind. He touched the brim of his hat and turned the stallion back down the trail toward town. What Hollis did not know, what she would not learn for several months, was that Mott did not sleep well that night. He had received 2 days earlier a second letter from his banker in Yankton. The letter used the phrase "serious doubts." The $3,000 barn had not been paid for. It had been borrowed for against the assumption of a beef market that had not that summer behaved the way Mott had promised his banker it would. He needed a strong fall sale at prices the market was not offering. He needed the appearance of unshakable prosperity. And he needed, perhaps most urgently, someone in this county to look more foolish than he felt. Hollis Vane, standing in a hole in a cliff with a long-handled shovel, was that person. By the end of August, he had given the cliff a name. The name that stuck was Vane's Folly. By September, it had entered the daily speech of Endeavor the way a good insult always does, quietly at first, then everywhere. To pull a Vane was to do a thing the long, hard, strange way, when a perfectly sensible, short way was sitting right there. The blacksmith pulled a Vane when he reforged a wheel rim by hand. A farmer pulled a Vane when he tried to dig his own well. Within 6 weeks, her surname had become a small unit of measurement in a town that had not known she existed 4 months before. The first serious visitor was Silas Webb. Webb was 52 years old and the most respected builder in the county. He came without theater, a plain buckboard, a tired bay horse, and a folding rule in the breast pocket of his coat that he carried the way some men carry a pocket watch, not to check the time, but because it was the right thing to have on your person. He walked the site for half an hour before he spoke a word. He measured things with his eye that most men would have needed instruments for. He put his hand on the cave wall the way Hollis had once put her hand on the wall of the railroad tunnel, though he did not yet know that and could not have said why he did it. When he spoke, what he said was worth listening to. You are setting your sill plates directly on bedrock. A house wants to settle, Mrs. Vane. A house wants a foundation that gives it half an inch or an inch over the first 2 years. You put a frame on solid rock, you don't get settle. You get split joints. By the third winter, every door in your cabin will stick or hang loose. The rock is limestone, Mr. Webb. It has been sitting where it is for longer than either of us can imagine. It has done its settling. That's not how a frame house behaves. It is how this frame house will behave. He grunted. He moved on. And you are running a stovepipe through a natural fissure in the ceiling rock. I am. That is a chimney fire waiting to happen. The fissure is not straight. The pipe will draw poorly. Creosote will build in the bends. One cold night you will hear a roar, and the next morning you will be standing in the ash. It was the first thing he had said that landed. Her face did not change, but the words had found a soft place, and he saw it in the half-second pause of Asa's hammer behind her and the way she held very still for a beat longer than necessary. Webb, who was not a cruel man, did not press. He folded his rule. He looked up into the dark shaft of the fissure as it climbed away into the rock above their heads. You are thinking about this too much. A square house on flat ground. That is what works out here. I have built 61 of them. They are still standing. The ones on flat ground are still standing because they have not yet met the wrong winter. He looked at her sharply. She had not raised her voice. She had not said it like an insult. She had said it the way one stonemason might say a thing to another as a fact about the world that did not require either of them to be wrong. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he climbed back into his buckboard. As he turned the bay toward town, he said over his shoulder, in a voice that was not quite casual, I hope you are not planning to find out which winter that is. I am not planning to find out, she said. I am planning not to be in it. He drove away without looking back. That evening at his kitchen table, he sat with his folding rule in his hands and stared at the surface of the wood for a long time. His wife set supper in front of him. He ate without tasting it. At one point, he said quietly to no one in particular, limestone doesn't settle. His wife asked what he meant. He shook his head, said it was nothing, set the rule aside. But he did not go to the saloon that night. The school teacher came not to the cliff, but to the children. Verity Finch was 28 years old and devoted to her students with the kind of bright, unwavering commitment that comes from a person who has found the one thing they are absolutely certain they are meant to do. She did not take notice of strangers as a rule. But Vane's folly had become, by the second week of September, a useful classroom example. Civilization, she explained to her students, was a forward motion. Humanity had once lived in caves. Humanity no longer did. To return to a cave was not a clever idea. It was a failure to understand what progress meant. Her students wrote it down. One of them did not. Lyndon Marsh was 10 years old, and he was the kind of boy who watched things being built with the focused attention most children give to stories. He thought about what Miss Finch had said on the walk home. He thought about it for the rest of the week. And on the following Saturday, he got up before his father was awake, climbed onto the back of the family mule, and rode 3 miles north to see for himself the bottom rung of the ladder that Miss Finch had said humanity was climbing off. What he found confused him in the productive way that good confusion works on a 10-year-old mind. He found a woman in a leather apron and a man in shirt sleeves moving 20-foot ponderosa logs with a horse, a chain, and a system of skids that looked to his eye like something someone had thought about for a long time before starting. He watched the woman set the butt end of a log against a guide stake and measure 5 times before cutting once. The cut was clean and square and did not need shaving. He watched the man pause halfway through a mortise to lay his cheek against the wood and listen to something that wasn't sound exactly more like the grain's intention. He felt even from where he stood 50 feet off in the sage, the difference in the air. The August sun was beating the prairie like a drum. The cave behind them was breathing out cold. Hollis noticed him after about 10 minutes. She did not call him over. She let him stand. After another 10 minutes, she walked casually to the water bucket, drank, and then walked toward him with the dipper still in her hand. She offered him the dipper when she reached him, did not ask his name. He drank, handed it back, looked up at her with the serious expression of a child who has decided to spend his question carefully. Miss Finch says caves are backwards. Miss Finch is a very fine teacher. But is she right? Hollis crouched down so her eyes were level with his. There are two kinds of forwards, she said. There is the kind where you walk away from what you came from because you want to leave it behind. And there is the kind where you walk back to what you came from because you learn something and you bring the new thing with you. We are not living in a cave. We are building a house. The house happens to be inside a cave. The cave will keep the house warm in winter and cool in summer on a quarter of the firewood it would take anywhere else through any storm this country has ever seen. That is not backwards. That is forwards, with both hands open. He thought about this. He was 10. He nodded slowly. He handed back the dipper, turned, and ran. Hollis watched him cross the sage flat at the easy, long-legged lope of a child who was going to be tall. She felt briefly the small private grief that always rose in her at the sight of a child running free in the summer light. She put the dipper back. She went back to work. The following Saturday, Lyndon Marsh was sitting on a rock at the edge of the sage when she walked out at dawn to check the sky. He had ridden the mule again. He had brought in a flour sack, 2 apples, and a folded piece of paper torn from his cipher book. On it, in careful pencil, he had drawn the cliff. Not well, but truly. The opening of the cave was the opening of the cave. The cabin that did not yet exist had been drawn inside it, square against the back wall, with a thin line of smoke rising from a stovepipe that climbed into the rock and disappeared. He had drawn the wind coming from the north, splitting around the curve of the cliff and passing on. He had drawn very small 2 figures and a horse in the dark interior. Hollis looked at the drawing for a long time. Asa came up behind her and looked at it over her shoulder. The small, careful half-smile she loved came onto his face. She handed the drawing back to Lyndon, told him it was a fine piece of work. She kept to herself the larger truth that no one in Endeavor had yet drawn what she had been trying to describe to them since July. Lyndon gave one of his apples to the horse, who took it with the considered politeness that the gelding brought to most transactions. Then Lyndon asked the question that Verity Finch had not thought to ask, whether in a storm the wind would come into the cave. Not past 20 feet. How do you know? Because the mouth is 40 feet across and the back narrows to 20. The cave squeezes the wind. The wind doesn't like to be squeezed. It slows down. By the time it reaches the cabin, it's just cold air. Cold air is manageable. Cold wind is what kills. He thought about this. He nodded the slow, deliberate nod of a child filing something away for permanent storage. He folded the drawing back into his cipher book, mounted the mule, and rode home. That afternoon, when Verity Finch asked her class what they had learned that week about the difference between progress and its absence, Lyndon Marsh kept his eyes on his slate and said nothing. Verity, who was sharp, noticed. In the second week of October, Asa rode south to the South Fork and came back with the wagon riding low and a piece of paper in his breast pocket on which a sheep farmer named Halstead had written in pencil, "Damn fool money for damn fool wool," with a small, grateful smile drawn underneath. 400 fleeces at 12 cents a pound. The wool market had gone soft. Halstead could not get a price for the spring shearing. Asa had paid what was asked and thrown in a bottle of his own preserved peaches. The fleeces filled the back of the cave, stacked to the ceiling along the north wall, dry as bone in the limestone air. The walls of the cabin did not yet exist, but the wool sat in the dark and waited. Hollis walked past the stack every morning and every evening, and allowed herself for a small private moment to feel the satisfaction of a fact that had not yet been spent. 400 fleeces, enough to pack the wall cavities twice over and still have wool remaining. Enough insulation to hold the warmth of a small stove against the coldest night this territory had ever recorded. The laughter in town had found a new pitch by then. The phrase Vane's Folly had completed its journey from joke to institution. Children used it. The blacksmith used it. The bartender had put it on a small chalkboard above the mirror behind the bar, beneath the weekly beef prices and the current temperature, as if it were a standing feature of local life. Hollis rode into town twice a week for supplies. She heard it. She filed it away in the same place she filed everything behind her eyes and below her sternum, where it became part of the record and did not require a response. She had learned in 8 years of survey work in country that did not particularly want to be surveyed that the loudest voices in any room were rarely the most informed ones. She had learned that the most dangerous thing a person could do was to make a decision based on what the room found amusing. She had learned this at 11 years old, kneeling on a plank floor in Vermont, listening to the sound a house makes when it is no longer a house. She loaded the wagon, she drove north, she went back to work. In the third week of October, Asa looked up one evening from the fire where he was whittling and said mildly into the middle distance, "That is a great deal of cornmeal for 2 people. I don't trust a winter to be a kind one." He went back to his whittling. She watched him work. The fire between them made small sounds of its own. A week later, without discussion, he doubled the order of cornmeal himself and let the matter rest. The night of the last truly warm evening of that autumn, a night in late October when the wind came from the west and smelled of cured grass and moved through the sage like a hand through long hair, Hollis opened the cedar trunk at the foot of the bed and took out the tin from the bottom. She unwrapped the square of apron cloth. She set the bird on the pine table. It was smaller than memory made it, a child's fist, wings folded tight along the body, the eye burned in with the tip of a nail still sharp after all these years, still watchful. She looked at it for a few minutes. The lamp made it cast a long, thin shadow across the table toward the cabin wall. Asa sat in the chair by the stove and read a month-old newspaper from Bismarck. He saw her take it out. He said nothing. He asked no questions. He understood without needing to be told that some things belong to the person who carries them, and that the most respectful thing another person can do is to witness without speaking. After a few minutes, Hollis wrapped the bird back in the apron cloth. She placed it in the tin. She set the tin at the bottom of the trunk and closed the lid. She did not sleep for some time. Outside on a small piece of ground, 300 yards south of the cliff, half buried in sage, a single rough headstone marked a winter the town of Endeavor had agreed by something like a collective exhale to stop talking about. The wind moved through the sage. The stars came out one at a time over the dark edge of the cliff. Inside the cabin, the stove ticked softly. The wool waited in the dark at the back of the cave. The brass bell hung on its iron hook at the cave mouth, still and silent in the mild October air. Hollis lay in the dark with her husband's hand on her shoulder, and the bird 3 feet from her head, and the winter she had been preparing for her entire life still 3 months away. She was ready. She was also afraid. Both things were true. She had learned from her father and from 8 years of field work, and from one February morning in Vermont, that she would never stop caring, that the two things very often arrive together, and that the one you act on is the one that determines what kind of person you are. She acted on the readiness. She closed her eyes. She let the earth breathe around her slow and even at 53 degrees, as it had breathed since before there were people on this continent to notice. The first fire they lit in the cabin stove burned for exactly 8 seconds before the smoke decided it had no interest in going up. It came back down the way water comes back down, with the patient, unhurried certainty of something that has gravity on its side. It rolled out of the firebox in a low-gray ball, climbed the inner wall of the cabin, and spread across the ceiling, the way spilled milk spreads across a table, finding every corner, filling every angle, moving with a kind of slow and absolute authority that left no room for argument. Asa stepped back, one hand across his mouth, eyes streaming. Hollis stood her ground. She did not cough. She watched the smoke the way she had learned to watch everything in the field, without reaction, without urgency, with the focused attention of someone who understands that what she is looking at is information, and that information properly read will tell her what to do next. The pattern was textbook. The fissure was not pulling. Worse than that, the fissure was breathing back. A column of cold, dense outside air was sitting inside the natural shaft above their heads, like a plug in a drain, and the warm air from the fire had nowhere to go but back into the room it had just come from. She closed the damper. The fire choked down to nothing. She opened the cabin door. The smoke walked itself out past the door frame with the unhurried dignity of something that had made its point and was now finished making it. Outside on the trail below the cliff, a small crowd had gathered. Word had carried in from town that the cave people were going to light their first fire that morning, and half a dozen men had ridden out on the reasonable assumption that whatever happened next would be worth seeing. They had not been wrong. They saw what they had come to see, smoke pouring from the cave mouth. Instead of the cliff top, a man in the cabin doorway with his eyes streaming, and a woman in a leather apron standing in the middle of the problem with her arms folded, looking up at a crack in the rock as if she could shame it into working properly. One of the men laughed. It was a short, satisfied sound. Another touched the brim of his hat to no one in particular and turned his horse toward town. By supper time, the saloon had a new chapter of the Vane's Folly story and the betting pool that had been opened 2 weeks earlier. How many weeks after the first hard freeze, before the cave woman gave up and asked Silas Webb to build her a proper house on the South Bottomland, had attracted 17 new entries. Silas Webb was not among them. He had ridden up alone 10 minutes before the first smoke appeared and stopped his buckboard at the foot of the trail. He had watched the entire thing from that distance without expression, without moving. When it was over, he clucked to his bay and turned the wagon back toward town. He did not go to the saloon that evening. He sat at his kitchen table and stared at the grain of the wood for a long while. His wife set supper in front of him. He ate without tasting it. At one point, he said quietly to the surface of the table, "A chimney that draws poorly in September will draw worse in January." His wife looked at him. He shook his head, said nothing more. Hollis stood at the foot of the cliff that evening and looked straight up. 40 feet of weathered limestone, nearly vertical, with a single tilted ledge 2/3 of the way up, that was perhaps 18 inches wide at its broadest point. The fissure opened into the sky at the top in a saddle between two low limestone ridges, exposed to every prevailing wind the prairie had to offer. She had known this. She had known it since the second day she spent in this cave, when she climbed up into the fissure with a candle and a coil of light rope, and felt the place where the crack jogged 8 inches to the north and narrowed by half before it continued upward. She had known with the part of her mind that had been trained over 8 years to read air movement the way other people read print, that the opening at the top was too wide and too flush with the ridgeline. Wind crossed it instead of lifting from it. And a chimney that wind crosses instead of lifting from does not pull smoke upward. It sits. It breathes back. It fills a room with everything you were trying to get rid of. Silas Webb had been right about that. She had simply not yet solved it. Asa came to stand beside her. He had washed his face. The redness was leaving his eyes. He looked up where she was looking and said nothing, because he already knew what she was looking at and had learned in the years of their marriage that she thought better when she was not being asked to think out loud. After a long moment, she said it quietly, more to hear it spoken than to inform him. "The fissure won't pull on its own. The opening at the top is too wide, too flush with the ridge. Wind crosses it instead of drawing up through it. We need a chimney cap, fieldstone 3 feet tall, narrowing at the throat. The faster the wind blows across the top, the harder it pulls the smoke up the column." Asa looked at the ledge 2/3 of the way up the cliff face, then at her. "I'll go up. You won't. That ledge will hold me." "It won't. Not at your weight. Not with 40 pounds of tools and mortar." He was quiet for a moment, not arguing, calculating. He knew the ledge. He had stood at the base of it enough times to understand that she was stating a physical fact, not making a judgment about his courage. She continued, "I'll go up at first light. Cedar rope doubled around the trunk of the big juniper at the top. I'll bowline it at my waist. I'll take the tools up in 3 trips before I start the stonework. I want the cap set before the first hard frost. We don't have many clear mornings left." What Asa said next was not agreement, and it was not objection. It was the thing he said when she had already decided, and he had already accepted, and what remained was only the practical question. "I'll belay you from the cedar." She nodded. They went inside. 3 days. That was what it took. The first day she moved stone. She had spent 2 weeks selecting field stone from the rubble field at the base of the cliff, pieces of the right size and shape, to build a narrowing chimney cap around an 8-inch oval opening in live rock, in a location where the wind came from 3 directions and the workspace was 18 inches wide. She had selected them the way her father had taught her to select stone for dry-laid work, not by size, first not by color, but by the feel of the flat faces against each other. A stone that fits is a stone that holds. She carried them up in a canvas sling, 3 and 4 at a time, the doubled hemp rope around her waist, Asa on the other end at the top of the cliff with his boots braced against the cedar. The ledge held her. It held her because she weighed what she weighed and had known since the first week she stood on it exactly what it would and would not forgive. The second day, she chipped the natural lip of the fissure smooth with a cold chisel and a 2-pound hammer, working in the particular rhythm of a person who knows that the goal is not to hit hard, but to hit exactly, and that there is a meaningful difference between those two things. She laid the first course of fieldstone and mortar around the rim, packed tight against the limestone, so that no wind could find the joint between old stone and new. On the third day, she raised the cap, course by course, narrowing the bore from the 8-inch oval of the fissure to a 6-inch round throat at the top. A flat capstone set on 3 iron pins angled to shed rain and snow and keep birds out, with a gap beneath it precisely calculated to let the wind cut across the opening at speed. It was on that third morning, halfway up the cliff face, traversing the ledge with the last bucket of mortar slung from her left shoulder, that she found the thing she had not been looking for. A thin, dark seam in the limestone running diagonally down the face of the cliff, no wider than her thumb, damp. And from it, very slowly, very steadily, a drip of water that ran down the face of the rock in a line so faint she might have missed it entirely if the morning light had been coming from a different angle. She stopped on the ledge. She put her tongue to the seam. The water was cold, clean, the mineral taste of deep limestone, the taste of water that has been moving through rock for longer than any human structure has been standing. She stood on that 18-inch ledge 40 feet above the sage flat, with the bucket of mortar on her shoulder and the morning wind moving her hair, and she traced the seam upward with her eye until it disappeared into the rock above the saddle, and traced it downward until she could see where it ended in the throat of the fissure they had been wrestling with for 6 weeks. She understood several things at once. The water had been running down the inside of the fissure slowly, seasonally, but consistently. A column of cool, damp air produced by that seeping water had been sitting inside the shaft, dense and cold, refusing to be displaced by the warm air from below. It was not only the open cap that had killed the draft. It was this. The fissure had been in effect self-cooling from within, which meant the cap alone would not have been enough, which meant she needed a diverter. She sat on the ledge for 10 minutes looking at the seam, running calculations she had no paper for. The mortar bucket grew heavier on her shoulder. She did not put it down. Then she climbed back down to where Asa stood with the rope. "There is a water seep in the fissure," she said. "It is part of why the draft never worked. We need a diverter." He listened. He did not ask her to repeat herself. He rarely did. She drew in the dust at the foot of the cliff with the tip of her chisel, a small angled trough of bent sheet iron mortared into the limestone wall 4 feet down, inside the fissure where it would catch any water descending from above and carry it sideways through a small chiseled channel out through the cliff face and into a holding niche they would line with fieldstone and lime. The water would not interrupt the draft. The water would become an asset. She looked up from the drawing in the dust. Asa was looking at her with the small, careful half smile that she had loved since the first evening they talked in the back of the furniture shop in St. Paul. "You found us water," he said. "The fissure found us water. We just have to listen to what the rock is telling us." They fired the stove for the second time on the afternoon of the same day the cap was set and the diverter was installed. The kindling caught with the soft white flame that dry cedar gives. For one held breath, the smoke hesitated at the elbow above the firebox, and then it moved. Up through the stovepipe, up into the fissure, up through 40 feet of limestone, and out of the cap at the top of the cliff in a thin, clean, steady column that the October wind took sideways and carried east toward the river. No rollback, no spillage, no gray ball spreading across the ceiling. Asa stood with his back to the stove and his palms turned to the heat, and he closed his eyes for a moment longer than strictly necessary. Hollis stood at the open cabin door and watched the smoke leave the top of the cliff in a straight line, and felt below her sternum the particular quiet satisfaction of a thing that has been reasoned through completely and has now agreed to work. The rock had been persuaded. More accurately, and she was precise about this, even in her own thinking, she had finally understood what the rock was already doing and had arranged herself accordingly. There was a difference. Webb came back on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of October, alone in his buckboard, without announcement, driving up the trail at the pace of a man who has something on his mind and has decided to do something about it. He climbed down at the foot of the cliff. This time he did not sit on his wagon bench and call across the distance. He walked to where Hollis was washing mortar from her hands in a tin basin, and he stood close enough that she did not have to raise her voice. He took his hat off. He had not done that on either of his two previous visits. "Mrs. Vane, may I see the diverter?" She showed him everything. She walked him into the back of the cave, up the natural stair of broken limestone, to the spring niche where the slow drip of the seam water fell into a lined fieldstone basin, clear and cold and steady. She showed him the sheet iron trough above it, mortared tight against the fissure wall. She showed him the elbow above the stove where the pipe entered the fissure packed in a collar of lime mortar. She showed him how the draft moved. Now she held a lit match at the collar, and they watched the flame lean cleanly upward, pulled not pushed. Webb looked at all of it. He said nothing for a long time. Then he dipped his chin. A small motion. But it went deeper than the motion he had made at their previous meeting. This was not acknowledgement. This was something else, the look of a man whose understanding of his own craft has just been quietly enlarged by someone he had underestimated. "I came up here today to tell you the second thing I have ever apologized for in my professional life," he said. "The first was a foundation I poured in 1878 that I should have known better about. This is the second. I told you the fissure was a chimney fire waiting to happen. I was wrong. What you have built here is a better flue than any brick chimney I have constructed in 30 years of work. I would like if you will allow it to come back when you have a moment and write down how you did the cap and the diverter. You can come back any day you like, Mr. Webb. Neither one is a secret." He put his hat back on. He looked at her for a moment longer with the expression of a man whose picture of the world has quietly rearranged itself and who is honest enough to acknowledge that the rearrangement was necessary. "I want my son to learn from you," he said, "when you have work to teach." Then he climbed back into his buckboard and turned the bay toward town. Hollis watched the wagon until it disappeared around the curve of the cliff trail. Then she went back inside and picked up her chisel. In the third week of October, Cyrus Mott received his third letter from the bank in Yankton. He read it twice, standing at his ranch office desk in the early morning before his foreman arrived and before any of his hands were up. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, in the same place Hollis Vane kept her deed, though for entirely different reasons. A junior officer from the bank arrived at the ranch 4 days later. He was a young man with a new coat and careful manners, and the slightly too controlled expression of someone who has been sent to deliver news that his superiors did not want to deliver in writing. He sat in the ranch parlor for 40 minutes. He drank 1 cup of coffee. He said almost nothing of substance. When he stood to leave and extended his hand, Mott shook it and smiled and walked him to his horse and watched him ride back toward town. Then he went back to the parlor and stood at the window and felt in the precise center of his chest the small, specific tightening of a man who has just realized that the fence post he has been counting on for 2 years is rotted at the base. The arithmetic was simple and merciless. He needed a strong fall sale. The fall market was not giving him what he needed. He needed his banker to believe that the operation was healthy, the herd was prime, the foreman capable. A man whose solvency is unquestioned does not need to defend his solvency. A man who needs to defend it has already lost the argument. That evening at the Mott home place, a young ranch hand named Cormac Pruitt was finishing the last of his supper in the bunkhouse when the foreman came in with the week's assignments. Cormac was 19 years old, the youngest hand on the operation, quiet and rangy, from a family in Yankton, good with horses, and reliably uncomplaining about whatever work was put in front of him. The foreman told him he'd be heading out to the line cabin northwest for the next stretch, keeping watch on 2 of Mott's prize bulls that had been moved there for the season. Cormac nodded, finished his coffee, and began packing his kit. Nobody thought anything of it. Mott, meanwhile, rode into town and stood 3 rounds for the bar. He told a new story about Vane's folly. This one involved smoke pouring from the wrong end of the cliff, which was true, and a woman who had finally been forced to hire a man from Bismarck to do the work she could not do herself, which was not. He added a detail about the nature of her relationship with this imagined man from Bismarck that had no basis in anything except his need at that particular moment to make sure the town was laughing at something other than his arithmetic. The bartender laughed. 2 men at the bar laughed. The story moved the way stories move in small towns, from mouth to mouth through the night. By Sunday morning, it had been refined, elaborated, and delivered in 3 separate forms to 3 separate congregations, each of which received it with the particular self-satisfaction of people who have found a story that explains why someone else's choices are the problem. It did not reach the cliff directly. It reached the cliff through Linden Marsh. He came on a Wednesday, which had become his regular afternoon, with his cipher book under his arm and his folding rule in his hip pocket. He had turned 11 the week before. Hollis had given him a used folding rule of her own, the brass hinge worn smooth from years of fieldwork, and he had carried it every day since, even on Sundays, when Verity Finch noticed it sticking out of his coat pocket and frowned but said nothing. He sat at the small pine table in the cabin and did not look at Hollis for the first 10 minutes. She made tea. She set a cup in front of him. She did not ask what was wrong because she had learned that he came to things in his own time, and that the worst thing you could do with a child who was working up to something was to interrupt the working up. Eventually, he looked at the surface of his tea and told her what was being said in town. His voice was low. When he finished, Hollis was quiet for a moment. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. "Mean things are easier than the others," she said. "They require less from the people telling them. Most people, when they are afraid, choose the easy thing. Do you understand?" He nodded slowly. "Then I told my father it was a lie." "What did your father say?" "He said to keep my mouth shut and finish my chores." Hollis looked at him across the table. She put her hand on the back of his, briefly, the way you touch something you don't want to startle. "Your father is keeping you safe, Lyndon. That is not nothing. Now drink your tea before it goes cold." The wind sharpened this morning. "We are going to talk about how to read what a barometer tells you before the sky shows anything." He drank his tea. He opened his cipher book to a fresh page. He drew the barometer face at the top of the page in careful pencil and wrote the date beside it. Outside, the sage had gone from summer green to autumn silver, and the light had the particular quality it gets in Dakota in late October, long and low, and without mercy, showing everything clearly, hiding nothing. The 63 cedar stakes went in during the first 2 weeks of November. Hollis did not announce them. She did not explain them. She simply began driving them one by one, working from the edge of town northward toward the cliff, spacing them 3 feet apart, using a hand-forged iron driver she had made herself from a piece of round stock. Each stake went in straight and firm, the top trimmed to a point so it would shed snow and remain visible above a modest drift. The storekeeper's wife saw her doing it on a Tuesday morning and asked when Hollis came in for thread that afternoon what the stakes were for. Hollis said that she did not trust a winter to be a kind one, and that if any traveler needed to find the cliff in bad weather, they would be able to do it by keeping a hand on the line of stakes. The storekeeper's wife laughed politely and forgot the conversation by supper. Hollis drove the last stake on a Thursday evening with Asa holding the lantern, the temperature dropping toward 20 and the first skin of ice forming on the water in the horse trough. She hung the brass bell on its iron hook just inside the cave mouth and stepped back to look at it. She set the oil lantern and the tinderbox in the small dry niche she had cut into the limestone at shoulder height, just inside the entrance where the wind could not reach. She did not explain any of this to anyone but Asa. Asa, watching her drive the last 3 stakes in the gathering dark, said, "You are building something for people who are not here. They will be." He helped her with the last 3 stakes. They walked back to the cliff together in the dark, the wind still soft and the smell of the sage all around them, the lights of Endeavor 3 miles back beginning to appear one at a time in the cold, clear air. Neither of them spoke again until they were inside. Verity Finch did not come to the cliff that autumn, but she thought about it more than she would have admitted to anyone, including herself. She was a young woman who had built her professional identity around a clear and coherent idea that progress moved in one direction, that civilization improved on what came before it, that the role of education was to help the next generation take the next step forward rather than any step back. These were not opinions she held lightly. They were the architecture of how she understood her work, and by extension, herself. Vane's folly troubled her in a way she found difficult to locate. It was not the cave itself. It was the boy with the folding rule in his hip pocket who sat in her classroom every day with that particular quality of attention present, but not quite there, as if part of him was somewhere else, measuring something she couldn't see. She had on 2 separate occasions walked to the window at the end of the school day and looked north toward the cliff without knowing exactly why. She had not walked further than that. Not yet. The barometer hung on the cabin wall on a nail beside the cedar trunk, in a brass case that Hollis had carried since her 3rd year with the Northern Pacific, when a survey chief named Driscoll had left it behind at a camp on the Red River, and she had kept it on the reasonable assumption that a man who left his barometer at a river camp was unlikely to have further professional use for one. She checked it every morning and every evening. She recorded it in a small notebook she kept on the shelf above the stove. Pressure, temperature, wind direction, cloud formation, bird behavior. 8 years of field training had made the recording as automatic as breathing, not a discipline she imposed on herself, but a habit so deep it no longer required a decision. In the last week of January 1884, she noted that the readings had begun to show a pattern she recognized. Not from her own experience. From the field reports she had read during her Northern Pacific years, reports from survey crews operating in the Black Hills and the high plains west of the Missouri, accounts of weather events so severe that they had their own entries in the railroad's operational logs. The pressure was not dropping. Not yet. But it was doing something subtler. It was refusing to rise the way it should have, after the mild spell of late January holding, at a level that suggested something large and slow, was organizing itself to the northwest. She noted it. She said nothing to Asa. There was nothing useful to say until the barometer gave her something specific. On the morning of February 8th, 1884, it gave her something specific. She had checked it at supper the evening before. The needle had been at 29.4 inches. She had noted it, closed the case, eaten her supper, read for an hour by lamplight, and gone to sleep. She woke before dawn and lay still for a moment listening. The wind was light, from the southwest. She could hear the sage moving outside, a soft, dry sound, the sound of a mild morning. She got up. She pulled on her coat and her boots and walked through the anteroom past the gelding, who raised his head and lowered it without concern, and out to the mouth of the cave. The eastern sky was a clear, hard blue. The temperature on the mercury thermometer nailed to the cliff face read 41 degrees. The wind from the southwest light carrying the smell of distant moisture. She looked west. The sky to the west was wrong. There was a band of yellow-gray clouds sitting on the horizon, thin at its upper edge, and thicker below, with a faint smear of green low down where the angle of the morning light caught it. The clouds were not moving the way clouds move when they are incidental weather. They were moving the way clouds move when they are the weather, with a low, purposeful solidity that she had seen described in field reports, but had never seen in person. The red-tailed hawks that had been working the prairie south of the cliff every morning for the past 3 weeks were not there. The blackbirds that moved through the cottonwoods along the creek each morning were not there. The air had a faint metallic taste, not the clean metal taste of approaching lightning, something else, something that had no common name she knew of. She went back inside. She took the barometer down from its nail and laid it flat on the pine table. The needle was at 28.7 inches. She stood looking at it, and the room was very quiet around her. 29.4 inches at supper. 28.7 inches now. A drop of 7/10 of an inch in less than 14 hours. In 8 years of field work for the Northern Pacific Railroad, across 8 winters and 3 mountain survey seasons, she had never seen a barometer fall that fast. She stood at the table for a long moment with both hands flat on the pine surface and felt running through her from her sternum to the base of her spine the small, clean, specific cold of a person who has just understood something completely. Asa appeared in the doorway from the bedroom, still pulling on his shirt. He looked at her. Not at the barometer. At her. "How bad?" he said. "The worst I have ever read. The pressure is collapsing. We have until late afternoon, 3 o'clock, possibly 4 if we are lucky." He did not panic. Asa Vane had never in her experience panicked. He turned back into the bedroom and finished dressing, and when he came out, he moved directly to the anteroom to begin doing, without instruction, the 5 things they had agreed upon 2 months earlier would need to be done if a storm of this magnitude ever gave them enough warning to prepare. Extra hay to the stalls, fill the iron cistern, stack the woodpile deeper inside the cave, trim the lantern wicks, check the oak door's iron bar and keeper. Hollis was already pulling on her second wool coat. She had built 63 stakes and a brass bell and an oil lantern in a stone niche. She had built them for exactly this morning. And not one of them was any use at all if the town 3 miles south did not know what was coming. She threw the saddle on the gelding. She did not speak to him as she tightened the girth. She didn't need to. He stood with the steady, patient calm of an animal that had decided years ago that when she moved with this particular quality of purpose, the correct response was to be ready. She swung up. She looked back once at the mouth of the cave, at the brass bell on its iron hook, at the lantern burning in the niche, at the dark interior where the air held its constant temperature, and the stacked cordwood and the sacks of cornmeal, and the 400 fleeces waited in the limestone quiet. Then she turned the gelding south and asked him for a pace she rarely asked of him. He gave it without complaint. The town of Endeavor on the morning of February 8, 1884, was going about its business in the mild air of what felt like the last kindness of a long winter. Doors were open. A man was repairing a fence along the south side of the main street. Two women stood talking outside the dry goods store in their coat sleeves, having taken the mildness as an invitation to shed the bulk of winter for a morning. Hollis tied the gelding at the rail outside the land office and went inside. Mayor Aldrich Pell was at his desk in his shirt sleeves working through a stack of correspondence that had arrived with the Wednesday mail wagon. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did what it always did. When she appeared without an appointment, it arranged itself into the careful neutrality of a man preparing to be patient with something inconvenient. She told him in 3 sentences what the barometer had read, what she had seen in the western sky, and what she believed was coming and when. He looked past her at the window. He looked at the mild blue sky visible through the glass. He looked at the open door and the sound of ordinary commerce moving through it. Then his face did the small, specific thing that faces do when a man has decided that his position is more important than his eyes. "Now, Mrs. Vane," he said, "that is just weather. We get weather in February. I cannot have you in the street saying things that will cause a panic. Mayor, you have until approximately 3 o'clock this afternoon to get every stove in this town stoked, every door braced, and every animal stalled. After 3 o'clock, no one will be able to cross the street. I can't have you frightening people on the basis of a barometer reading." She left him on the steps. She walked to the feed store. The old man who sat on his barrel by the stove listened to her for 30 seconds, then stood up without a word and walked out the back of the store, and within 10 minutes, she could see him in the alley with 2 of his sons, all 3 of them moving with the purposeful urgency of people who have heard something they believe. She walked to Webb's house. He was already at his door. He had stepped outside to look at the western sky an hour before her arrival and had not gone back inside. He listened to her for half a minute. "How long?" he said. "By 3. 4 if we are lucky. My family to your cave. If anything goes wrong before we get there, the stakes, the bell, the lantern. I know the way," he said. She nodded and kept walking. At the schoolhouse, Verity Finch was at the front of the room, chalk in hand, mid-sentence, in an arithmetic lesson. She stopped when Hollis came through the door without knocking. The room of 26 students turned as one. Among them in the 3rd row, Lyndon Marsh watched Hollis cross the threshold with the alert stillness of a child who has been expecting something important to happen and is now watching it happen. Hollis spoke past Verity to the room. "There is a storm coming this afternoon, the worst this country has seen. Tell your mothers, tell your fathers, tell anyone you pass on the way home. If your house goes dark before evening, leave it. Follow the line of cedar stakes north of town. They run all the way to the cliff. Ring the bell if you find it. We will hear you. We will come out." She left before Verity could respond. As the schoolhouse door swung shut behind her, she heard the teacher's voice rise bright and deliberately calm, redirecting the class toward their times tables. Hollis did not stop walking. She had one more conversation to have, and she had known since she left the cave that morning that it would be the hardest one. Cyrus Mott was crossing the street between the saloon and the hardware store when she came out of the schoolhouse. He had heard the town was small and she had been moving through it for 40 minutes, and nothing moved faster in a small town than the news that something unusual was happening. He stopped in the middle of the street and waited for her. 6 men had paused in doorways along the main street watching. The bartender stood on his step with a rag in his hand. A woman at the dry goods counter had moved to the window. Mott had his thumbs in his vest, and his voice pitched to Carrie. "Mrs. Vane." "A word. I don't have time, Mr. Mott." "I think you do. I think you have all the time in the world for what I'm going to say, because what I'm going to say is this. You are running through this town, frightening women, and ruining a perfectly reasonable morning on the strength of a barometer, reading in a cave that you own and operate, and I will not stand here and watch you do it." She stopped. She looked at him not with anger and not with contempt, with something colder and more precise than either. The look she had learned to use when a section line did not close, and she needed to find the error without making it personal. "It ends where you decide it ends, Mr. Mott. If you listen to me, you will live through what is coming. If you listen to yourself, you will not. I do not particularly care which you choose. She walked past him to where her horse was tied. She mounted. She turned north. Behind her, Mott laughed the practice-carrying laugh of a man performing confidence for an audience. Several doorways obliged him with a laugh in return, not all of them. Verity Finch, standing in the open door of the schoolhouse, watched Hollis Vane ride north along the main street and out past the last building and into the open country where the cedar stakes ran in a straight line through the sage toward the limestone cliff. She stood there for a long moment after the rider had gone. Then she looked at the western sky. The yellow-gray band that had been on the horizon 2 hours ago was not on the horizon anymore. It had moved east. It had grown. It sat now across the entire western quarter of the sky with the low, certain advancing weight of something that had made up its mind. Verity Finch went back inside her classroom. She put down her chalk. She began quietly and without explanation to put on her coat. The storm arrived at 3:17 in the afternoon by Asa Vane's pocket watch, which he had set that morning against the bank clock on the main street of Endeavor before Hollis had ridden in to give her warnings. He noted the time not because it mattered in any practical sense, but because he was a man who believed that the things which happened to you deserved to be recorded accurately. That the world had a right to be witnessed precisely even when, especially when, what it was doing was trying to kill you. What it did at 3:17 was this. The wind, which had been building since noon and had reached 40 miles an hour by 3 o'clock, jumped to 70 in less than 60 seconds. Not a gust, not a surge, a wall. A single sustained lateral force that hit the cliff face with a sound like the world clearing its throat and then settled into a roar so constant and so complete that it stopped being a sound and became instead a condition like pressure, like temperature, like the specific quality of darkness inside a sealed room. The snow that had not been falling at 3:16 was at 3:18 driving horizontally with a force that could take the air directly out of a person's lungs if they turned their face into it. The temperature on the mercury thermometer nailed to the cliff face outside the cave mouth fell from 28 degrees to 8 degrees in the first 10 minutes. Then it kept falling. Inside the cave, Hollis closed the heavy oak door. The iron bar dropped into its keeper with the small, definite sound of something being decided. Asa fed 2 splits of seasoned oak into the stove. The cabin, which had been holding at 66 degrees, climbed to 68 and held there. In the anteroom, the gelding lifted his head once at the largest gust, a long, low vibration that passed through 40 feet of limestone and arrived inside the cave as a kind of pressure rather than a sound, and then set his head back down and went on breathing at the slow, even pace of an animal that had decided the situation did not require him to revise his opinion of the world. The wool in the walls did its work. The limestone did its work. The constant temperature of the earth itself did its work. The cabin was a small warmth held inside a larger constant, the way a coal stays hot inside a closed hand. Outside, the storm did what it had come to do. The first day passed in the way first days of extraordinary things always pass badly, but with the comfort of not yet knowing how much more there is to come. By the end of the second day, they knew it would last longer. By the end of the third, they had stopped counting days and started counting the things that still held. The food held. Hollis had laid in 3 times what 2 people needed for a full Dakota winter, and what had seemed like excess in October, the 50-pound sacks of cornmeal along the back wall, the salt pork in the cold cellar, the dried apple and smoked venison, and the wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth, the crocks of sauerkraut, and the gallons of molasses, and the coffee and sugar and flour, now revealed itself as the most useful thing she had ever done in her life. She had not done it because she had known this storm was coming. She had done it because she had been raised by a man who lost a daughter to a night he was not prepared for. And she had carried that lesson in a tin at the bottom of a cedar trunk for 22 years. And she had finally, in the summer of 1883, understood what the lesson was asking her to build. The water held. The spring niche behind the false wall of the cabin dripped its quarter-gallon an hour into the lined fieldstone basin, steady and cold, and entirely indifferent to the chaos above the limestone roof. She rationed it carefully, for drinking, for washing, for the kettle that ran from before dawn until after dark. The people arrived. They came by 1s and 2s, and once by a family of 4 following the line of cedar stakes that ran from the edge of town north through the sage to the foot of the cliff. They came with frost on their coats and fear in their faces, and the particular stunned quality of people who have just discovered that the world they thought they understood has been replaced without warning by a different and considerably more serious one. Lyndon Marsh had been at the cave since the morning before the storm. He had ridden the mule up to ask Hollis a question about cumulus formations. He had been keeping a weather notebook of his own since October modeled on hers, and she had taken one look at the western sky and told him to send the mule home alone with a note pinned to the saddle blanket for his parents. The mule had made it back. The note had reached his father. His father had read it standing at the kitchen table and then read it again, and then sat down in a way that men sit down when their legs have received news their mind has not yet processed. The boy was in a cave with the woman in the leather apron. He was safer there than in any frame house in Endeavor. His father had understood that night sitting at his kitchen table while the wind found the gaps in his siding and the temperature in his front room dropped toward 40 degrees, that this was the new shape of things. That the woman who had been the punchline of every joke in the county for 7 months had known something the rest of them had not, and that the shape of that knowing was currently keeping his son warm 3 miles north of where everything else was falling apart. Lyndon stood at the mouth of the cave in his coat, the brass cowbell in his mittened hand ringing 5 strokes every quarter hour, counting to 10, ringing 5 more. Into the white horizontal blast that was the world beyond the cave mouth, he sent his signal again and again through the first night and the second, and into the third, pausing only when Hollis made him come inside and sit by the stove for 20 minutes before sending him back out. He did not complain about the cold. He did not ask how much longer. He rang the bell the way he did everything since October, with the focused, deliberate attention of a child who has found the thing he is supposed to be doing and intends to do it correctly. By the end of the first day, there were 11 people in the cave. By the end of the second, 17. They came in through the storm following the cedar stakes, each one arriving with less left in them than the last each one handed to the warmth of the anteroom, where the temperature held at the same steady point it had always held, indifferent to what was happening 50 feet above. On the second night, Hollis woke at 2 in the morning with a faint pressure behind her eyes. She had felt it once before in a survey tent outside Jamestown, pinned down for 4 days with 11 men in a February blizzard when the tent had been sealed too long and the air had gone thick, and the first sign had been exactly this. Not dizziness, not headache, but a soft, specific pressure, like a thumb pressing gently from behind the eyes. She was out of bed before she was fully awake. She took the candle from the bedside table and moved through the cabin into the anteroom, and then walked the perimeter of the cave where 17 people were sleeping on their bedrolls across the dry stone floor. She held the candle at chest height and moved it slowly. At 4 spots along the back wall, the flame moved wrong. Not extinguishing, not guttering, just bending slightly in the wrong direction, away from the stove, instead of toward it, pushed by something she could not see but understood immediately. The air in the cave was stratifying. 17 people breathing in a sealed limestone volume for 2 days. The carbon was collecting at the lower levels. The cave mouth was wide, but the storm had effectively sealed it with horizontal snow and force, and what had been the cave's greatest virtue in summer, its deep, still interior had become, in these specific circumstances, a liability that would grow worse as more people arrived. She woke Asa. She woke Webb. She took her candle and climbed the natural limestone stair at the back of the cave to the upper chamber she had explored in September, and never used a smaller room, perhaps 12 feet across, connected to the main cave by a narrow passage that she had noted then and filed away as interesting and not yet useful. She held the candle at the passage entrance. The flame pulled upward, cleanly. There was a draft moving down from some unseen opening higher in the cliff, cold air descending from above, pushed by the pressure differential the storm had created outside. She came back down. Webb and Asa were waiting. She showed them the spot above the root cellar entrance where the rock ran up to the passage. She showed them what she needed, a 6-inch opening between the main cave chamber and the upper room, enough to let the air column turn over enough to let the heavier bad air at the lower levels be displaced by the cooler, cleaner air descending from above. They worked through the rest of the night, cold chisel and 2-pound hammer spelling each other in 15-minute rotations while the other held the lantern. The limestone gave way in small, controlled pieces, the way limestone always does when it is properly asked. By dawn, the passage was open. The candle flame at the back wall pulled cleanly upward. The pressure behind Hollis's eyes was gone by the time she ate breakfast. Not one of the people sleeping on the cave floor ever knew what had been measured and corrected in the dark above their heads during those hours. They woke to air that tasted the same as it had the night before, which was the point and which was the only outcome that mattered. More people came on the third day and the fourth, 23 in total by the fifth evening. Hollis wrote the rotation schedule on the blackboard with chalk, 2 hours in the cabin warmth for each group, then back to the anteroom, then 2 more hours for the next group. She cooked in the largest kettle from before first light until after dark. Asa portioned, Webb organized. Lyndon rang the bell. And somewhere in the white miles to the northwest in a line cabin with 2 bowls and a stove that had gone cold 3 days earlier, a 19-year-old ranch hand named Cormac Pruitt was making calculations of his own. He had been there since before the storm. He had run out of cornmeal on the third day. He had kept himself alive on the body heat of the animals and the specific grinding determination of a young man who had not yet been fully persuaded that the world had the authority to defeat him. On the morning of the fifth day, when the wind dropped a quarter notch, he had pulled on everything he owned and started walking. He did not know about the stakes. He did not know about the bell. He knew only that there was a town 8 miles to the southeast, and that if he could reach it, he would live, and that if he could not, he would not. He walked all of what remained of the fifth day and into the night. Somewhere in the dark and the white going by feel more than sight. His right shin connected with something hard and wooden. A cedar stake driven into the frozen earth, its pointed top just above the drift line. He stopped. He put both hands on it. He stood there for a long moment in the howling dark, understanding what it was. Someone had put this here before any of this had happened. Someone had stood in a mild autumn afternoon and driven this stake into the ground for a person they had never met who would need it on a night exactly like this one. He turned his body to follow the line of stakes and began to walk again. The bell reached him over the last quarter mile, faintly at first, carried on the half seconds when the wind dropped enough to let sound travel, and he had not been certain at first that it was real. He had been walking long enough that real and unreal had begun to occupy the same space. But the bell persisted. 5 strokes account 5 more. Too regular to be accidental. Too specific to be wind. He walked toward it. Lyndon saw the shape come over the ridge of the trail and rang the bell continuously without pause, exactly as he had been told. Asa went out with the second lantern. He found Cormac Pruitt 60 yards from the cave mouth, still upright, still moving, encased in ice and snow, so thick that the shape he cut in the lantern light was not quite human. It was something larger and cruder, a rough approximation of a person assembled from what the blizzard had deposited on him over 2 days of walking. He was conscious. He was not fully present. His eyes were open and tracking the lantern, but the expression behind them was the expression of someone whose mind has retreated to a room at the back of the house and closed the door. Asa got his arm under him. They came in together. Inside the cave, Hollis knelt on the limestone floor and broke the ice from his face with her gloved hands, carefully, the way you clear snow from a thing you are not certain is unbreakable. The face beneath it was 19 years old and the color of birch bark, and wore the particular stillness of extreme cold. Not the stillness of sleep, but the stillness of a machine that has been running on its last reserves for so long that every non-essential process has been suspended. His lips moved. She leaned closer. He was saying something about Yankton, about his mother, about the main street of Yankton and the way the river looked in the early morning, and the lamps along the depot when the eastbound came through. They worked on him for 4 hours. Asa held his hand, which was the right thing to do, and the only thing to do, and Asa knew both of these things without being told. Webb sat on the other side and held the lamp steady. Hollis worked the frost from his extremities with the careful, systematic patience of a person who understands that what she is doing is not warming a body, but persuading it slowly, incrementally, at the pace the tissue could accept, that warmth was something it still had a claim to. She talked to him about Yankton. She had been through Yankton once in the summer of 1879 with a Northern Pacific survey crew cutting a spur line toward the Missouri. She remembered the main street, the long unpaved stretch of it, the storefronts with their false fronts, catching the morning light, the ferry crossing, and the way the river smelled of mud and distance. She remembered the depot lamps, which were amber in a particular way, that depot lamps are amber, the color of something functional that has accidentally become beautiful. She described all of it to Cormac Pruitt in a steady, quiet voice. Not urgently, not with the false brightness of someone trying to call a person back from a place they have gone. With the calm, even tone of someone describing a real place that exists and will continue to exist, and that the person being spoken to has every reason to return to. He died at sunrise on the seventh morning. He did not, in the 4 hours before he died, ever quite look directly at another person. His eyes moved toward sounds, toward the lamp once, toward Hollis's voice when she said the word depot, but the focusing mechanism had given out somewhere in the line cabin, or in the white miles between there and here, and could not be recovered. Hollis closed his eyes with her thumb. She stood up. She did not allow herself to sit back down. There were 23 other people in this cave, and the morning was beginning, and there was work that needed to be done, and the only thing she could give Cormac Pruitt now was to keep doing the work that had not been enough to save him for the people it was still possible to save. She walked through the anteroom and out to the mouth of the cave. The storm had broken. Not completely, the eastern sky still carried a low haze of driven snow, and the wind was still 25 miles an hour. But the main body of it had passed, and for the first time in 7 days, there was a sun visible low and cold and brutally clear, casting long shadows across the white field of the prairie below the cliff. She stood at the cave mouth and turned her face up to it. She had not seen the sun in a week. Her shoulders shook once, twice. Then they stopped. Asa stood behind her in the cave mouth and did not touch her. He understood, in the way that a man understands things after enough years of paying close attention to a person he loves, that what she needed from him in this moment was not comfort. It was witness. To stand close enough that she knew she was not alone, and far enough that she had the space the grief required. After a while, she turned around. She went back inside. On the morning of the 7th day, with the wind down to 30 miles an hour and the temperature at 20 below survivable if you were careful and roped, Hollis and Asa prepared to go into town. They had argued about it the night before briefly and without raising their voices. Asa had lost on the argument she did not need to repeat. He outweighed her by 30 pounds. The drifts had been building for 7 days in the particular dense wind-packed way that Dakota blizzard snow builds, not the loose, light accumulation of an ordinary snowfall, but something closer to compacted sand waist-deep on the flats and shoulder-deep where the terrain had piled it. 30 fewer pounds moved through that material with a different calculus. It was not a question of courage or strength. It was geometry, and Asa understood geometry. He belayed her from the cave mouth with a rope tied to the iron ring set in the cliff face. She paid it out as she went 63 stakes worth of hemp, enough to reach the first buildings of town and back. If the wind rose again before she returned, the rope would tell her which way was home. She left at first light. Lyndon stood at the cave mouth and watched her go. She had given him his instructions: ring the bell every quarter hour, continuous strokes, if he saw anyone come over the ridge. He had nodded with the serious, settled nod of someone who does not need to be told a thing twice. He was 11 years old. He had been ringing that bell in the dark for 7 days. He would ring it for as long as it needed to be rung. What she saw when she came over the South Ridge stopped her. She had known in the abstract that the town would be damaged. She had not known until she stood on that ridge in the flat gray light of the 7th morning and looked down at what had been Endeavor, Dakota territory. That damage was the wrong word for what had happened to it. Endeavor was gone. Not entirely. The church steeple stood. The brick chimney of the land office stood. The first floors of a dozen houses showed above the drift line, their roofs and upper stories visible only as long, low white humps that could have been anything. Hills, haystacks, the rounded backs of buried things. The rest was a featureless plain of wind-sculpted snow, scored by the long parallel ridges that a sustained directional wind leaves when it has had 7 days to work unopposed. She stood on the ridge for a moment and looked at it. Then she went down. She went to Webb's house first. She had told Silas Webb in the street on the morning of February 8th that if anything went wrong before his family reached the cave, they should follow the line of stakes, ring the bell, and wait. She had told him this, and he had nodded once in the precise way of a man who intends to remember exactly what he has been told. His house was on the north edge of town, 2 blocks past the schoolhouse. She reached it by following the nearly erased line of the street, visible only as a slight depression in the drift. The front door was buried to the top of its frame. She cleared it with the wide, flat shovel she had carried strapped across her back, a job that took 20 minutes in the packed snow, and pried the door open and went inside. The house was 12 degrees. It was the deepest cold she had ever felt inside a building. Not the clean cold of open air, but the used-up cold of a space that has been surrendering heat for 96 hours without replacement. The cold of abandonment. The cold of a place where the fire went out days ago and nothing has been warm since. She found the cellar door under the kitchen table. She opened it. In the lamp-lit dark below, she found Webb's wife, a heavy woman in her mid-40s, with a face the color of old paper, and the deliberate hoarded movements of someone who has been spending herself carefully against the possibility of running out. Two small girls were under three quilts beside her. One candle burned on a saucer. Two others had been burned to nothing. The woman looked up at Hollis. She said with what she had left Silas, "He is alive. Eli is alive. They are at our place. We are going to take you there now." Webb's wife began to cry without sound, the tears moving across her dry cheeks with the slow, gravity-driven patience of water finding its level. The older girl, perhaps 4 years old, looked up at Hollis from the quilts with clear, serious eyes and said in a voice that struck the cellar air like a small bell, "Are you the cave lady I am? Papa said you would come." They moved the family in two careful relays, the children wrapped in blankets, and carried the wife walking between Hollis and Asa with their arms locked through hers for the stretches where the drift was manageable, and carried the rest of the way. The rope was their compass and their safety, and the only reason they did not lose the trail twice in the sections where the wind had swept the snow into a uniform surface that gave no indication of direction. When they reached the cliff, Lyndon rang the bell in the long, continuous peal Hollis had shown him for the arrival of people who needed help. Webb heard it from inside the cabin and came as far as the cave mouth on legs that had no business carrying him. He sat down on the limestone at the entrance and held his wife and then each of his daughters and said nothing at all for a long time. The older girl put her hand on the cave wall and looked up at the limestone ceiling above her. "It's warm," she said with the simple matter-of-fact surprise of a child reporting a meteorological fact. "Yes," Hollis said. "It is." She went out again at 9 o'clock, this time alone with the second coil of rope. She found Verity Finch in the cellar of the Mercer family's frame house on the south side of the main square, with 3 students whose homes had been closest to the school. The cellar window was buried. Hollis dug down to it with the shovel, broke the glass with the iron flat of the blade, and called in. Verity's face appeared at the broken window in the dim cellar light. It was white and unwashed and held a quality of fear that had been lived with for long enough to become familiar. And when she recognized the face looking down at her through the broken glass, something moved through her expression that was not quite relief. It was more complicated than relief, more honest than relief. The look of a person who was right about something and wrong about something else, and had just understood both at once. Hollis brought the children up first, one at a time through the window, and then Verity, and then stood at the top of the cellar excavation and looked at the house above them. She did not go in. She did not need to. The particular quality of silence that came through the floorboards above their heads told her what she needed to know, and she had learned enough about the specific language of silence over the course of her life to be confident in her reading of it. Mr. and Mrs. Mercer had not woken up. She brought the children to the cave in 2 trips, leaving Verity for the second run, because Verity's hands were shaking, and her voice had gone thin in a way that indicated she needed to be warm and fed before she could be trusted on the rope line in the wind. On the second trip, moving back through the drifted street with the last 2 children, Hollis passed a section of the main road where Mott's barn was visible from the side, or rather where it had been visible from the side. What remained of the $3,000 barn, the finest building in the county, built from white oak by a man out of Minneapolis, joined and braced and perfectly constructed by every standard the territory could apply, was a series of collapsed angles half buried in a drift that had over the course of 7 days grown to a height of 15 feet against the barn's north wall. The barn had done exactly what a well-built wall does when placed perpendicular to a sustained directional wind. It had stopped the snow. It had held it. It had built over 7 days a drift of such density and height that the 6 houses immediately south of it, in the lee of the barn's north wall, sheltered from the wind itself, but buried by everything. The wind was carrying had received not the modest accumulation of the open prairie, but the full concentrated weight of 7 days of blizzard snow that the barn had gathered and organized and delivered to their roofs and doors and windows. 3 of those 6 families had survived by digging upward through their own chimneys when the first floors filled and the doors would not open. 2 had been found already dazed and frostbitten and alive. The 3rd family, the Pruitt household, where the Mott operations foreman had lived with his wife and their infant son, had not been found yet. They were found on the 8th day. The foreman and his wife were in the back bedroom, under every quilt they owned in the place they had retreated to when the smoke from the iced-over chimney had filled the kitchen, and they had nowhere left to go. They had gone there to keep warm and had kept each other as warm as two people can keep each other when the temperature outside is 45 degrees below zero and the house has been without heat for 4 days. Their infant son was in his mother's arms. He had a warmth in him, still faint, the warmth of a banked coal rather than a burning one, but present, real, documentable. His parents did not. Hollis carried the infant to the cave herself, wrapped in the quilt from his parents' bed. She did not run. She moved at the pace that the snow and the rope and the wind allowed, which was steady and careful, and she held the child against her chest inside her coat for the warmth her own body could provide. And she did not let herself think about anything except the next cedar stake, and the one after it, and the one after that. When she reached the cave, she placed the child in the arms of Webb's wife, who had milk because her youngest was still nursing. The infant cried once briefly at the cold. Then he fed. He lived. On the afternoon of the 8th day, Aldrich Pell came in. He had spent the storm in the saloon, taken in by the bartender after his office roof gave way on the third night. He had walked to the saloon in his shirt sleeves and one boot in the dark, 400 yards through a blizzard, and the fact that he had made it said something about either his luck or his constitution that he did not feel entitled to take credit for. He was sitting on the windward side of the buried boardwalk when Hollis came through town on her third day of recovery operations. He had his hat off and his hands in his lap, and the expression of a man who has had a great deal of time to sit with himself and has not found the company entirely comfortable. He stood when he saw her. She stopped. He looked at his boot toes, then at her face. "Mrs. Vane," he said, "I will walk with you to the cliff if you will have me. Walk where I walk. Touch each stake as you pass it. Do not stop." He nodded. They set out along the line of stakes in the hard, flat light of the winter afternoon. They walked for several minutes without speaking. Then Pell spoke in the voice of a man releasing something he has been holding for a long time. Not dramatically, not with the performed quality of confession, but with the flat, tired tone of someone who simply needs a thing to be said before it can stop weighing what it weighs. "The family in 1872, he said. "The headstone south of the cliff. I was on the original land board. I was the only member who knew what that ground was capable of because I had been here the winter it happened, and I had seen it. I let the town sell that bottomland to the next 10 settlers because the rail talk was coming, and the bottomland was what we had to sell. I let the story die because the story was bad for business. I have been the mayor of this town for 9 years on the strength of a thing I did not say." He paused. "I am telling you now because if I do not tell you now, I will not tell anyone. And a man who carries that to his grave is a worse man than I am willing to be." Hollis walked. She did not soften her face, and she did not harden it. She had known since the afternoon she found the headstone that this moment existed somewhere in the future. She had not known it would come here on this trail, in this light from this man. But she had known it was coming the way you know certain weather is coming before you can see it. "There is a time to settle that account," she said. "This is not it. Walk where I walk." He walked where she walked. When the cliff came into view, he said quietly into the wind, "I am sorry." She did not answer. There would be time. Cyrus Mott came on the evening of the 8th day. He came alone on a horse borrowed from the relief supply wagon that had come through from Mandan that afternoon. His own horses were dead. His barn was a ruin. His foreman was dead. His banker was somewhere east of the Missouri on a snowbound train. His stock showed the event he had planned as the public demonstration of his unshakable solvency was 3 weeks away, and there was nothing left to show. He rode up the cliff trail in the last light and stopped at the cave mouth and took his hat off. He did not come inside. Hollis went out to him. He sat his borrowed horse without the silver-trimmed saddle because the silver-trimmed saddle had been in the tack room of the barn, and the barn was a ruin, and the tack room was under 15 feet of compacted snow. He sat the borrowed horse the way a man sits a horse when he has recently stopped being the kind of man he thought he was and has not yet decided what kind of man he intends to be next. He looked at her. "My barn killed 3 families on the lee side," he said. "I know. The drifts built against the north wall. 6 houses buried. 3 families who might have made it otherwise. I know. You told me on the 8th of February. I called you a liar in the street in front of witnesses. I know. There is no part of this for which I am not responsible. That is not entirely true, she said. The storm was the storm. The barn was the barn. You did not put the storm in the sky. You put the barn where you put it. Those are two different things. He was quiet for a long moment. What can I do, he said. Come inside. Eat. Sleep. Tomorrow we talk about what you can do. He came inside. He slept on a wool blanket on the limestone floor of the anteroom, 12 feet from a woman he had not yet identified as the widow of the man who had worked for him, who had not yet been told that her husband was not coming back from the storm. He lay awake most of the night. At some point in the small hours, he sat up and pressed the heels of his hands against his closed eyes until the darkness produced its own light. Then he lay back down and stared at the limestone ceiling and listened to 23 people breathing in the dark around him. He had never heard that sound before. The specific sound of a group of people sleeping safely in a place that is holding them. The sound of bodies that have been cold for a long time and are now warm and have let go of the particular tension that cold produces in every muscle of a person who is not sure somewhere below conscious thought whether they are going to survive the night. It was the sound of something working the way it was supposed to work. In the morning, Hollis sat across the pine table from him and told him what he could do. There was money what remained after the sale of the surviving half of his herd, which was not much, but was something. It would go to 3 people, Webb, a homesteader named Hatcher, who had walked in from the east on the 5th day, and the pastor of the smaller of Endeavor's 2 churches, since the larger no longer had a pastor. The 3 of them would administer what the families on the lee side of the barn needed for the next year. He would visit each household. He would sit at each kitchen table. He would say without his hat what he had said to her at the cave mouth the evening before. The last table he would sit at would be the widow's. He listened to all of it. He nodded once. He took the envelope back. He stood up. He said more quietly than she had ever heard him say anything in 7 months of acquaintance, "I will." Then he went out. On the afternoon of the 9th day, Hollis and Lyndon walked south along the trail together in the long, cold, flat light that follows great storms. The light that shows everything clearly, because it comes from a low angle and casts long shadows and refuses to flatter anything. They walked without urgency. The crisis was not over. The relief wagon from Mandan had arrived the day before, and the work of accounting for the damage and the dead and the living was ongoing and would be ongoing for weeks. But there was a quality to this afternoon that was different from the 7 days before it. The quality of aftermath, of standing in the wreckage of something large and beginning slowly to take stock of what remains. Lyndon was quiet for a while. Then he asked the question he had been working up to since the morning. Why did you do all of this for people who laughed at you for 7 months? Hollis walked 20 paces without answering. She stopped at the place she had known somewhere in the back of her mind that she would stop. The place where, half hidden in the sage and half buried in the remnants of the storm's snow, the rough headstone of 1872 stood. She bent and cleared the top of it with her gloved hand. The name was still gone. The date was still there. It had been there for 12 years and would be there after both of them were gone, and the stone had never needed anyone's help to do what it was doing. She stood up and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the boy beside her, who looked back with the steady, serious attention he gave to everything. When I was 11 years old, she said, my sister Elsie was 4. We lived in Vermont. Our house was built on the wrong piece of ground by a man who built quickly and did not think carefully, and one February night the wind found the corner of it and took the roof down. Elsie was asleep under the eaves. She did not look away from the headstone while she said this. She did not wake up. I have spent 21 years building houses that the wind cannot take. I have spent 21 years laying in food for people I did not know I was preparing for. I thought all that time that I was doing it for her. I thought I was trying to correct a mistake that could not be corrected. I did not know until last week that I had been doing it for them. For the people in this town who laughed at me and were wrong about what I was building, but were not wrong about needing someone to build it. She paused. The two things turned out to be the same thing. Lyndon was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, the bird on your table. In October. I came in for water when you were on the cliff. It was on the table. I didn't touch it. She looked at him. I knew it wasn't mine to touch, he said. She felt something move in her chest. Something old and specific, the way ice moves in a river at the beginning of the thaw, not breaking, not yet, but shifting, acknowledging the season. Does it have a name? She asked. His voice was careful. Sister. She looked at him for a long moment. That is a good name, she said. Yes, he said. They stood there for another moment in the cold, flat light, the two of them, in the headstone and the sage, and the long white field of the post-storm prairie. Then they turned and walked back toward the cliff together. Behind them, the shadow of the headstone reached east across the trail. Ahead, the lantern in the niche at the cave mouth burned its small, clean yellow against the dark limestone lit by Asa, while they were walking as it had been lit every 2 hours for 7 days, because that was the kind of man he was. The gelding raised his head when they came into the anteroom. He regarded them with the dark, considering eye of a horse that has made a study of human beings over many years and reached certain conclusions. Then he lowered his head and went back to his hay. The cave held its temperature. It always did. Silas Webb spent a week in the cave after the storm ended, using the time the way he used time when he had something important to learn. Methodically, question by question, with his leather-bound notebook open on the pine table, and his handwriting, ordinarily a careful copperplate, taking on toward the end of the week, a sloped and urgent quality that was almost not his. He asked about the orientation, the wall construction, the wool in the cavities, the limestone piers, the root cellar, the spring niche and the diverter, the upper chamber for air, the fissure cap. He asked about the cedar stakes and the bell and the lantern niche, and she answered everything, holding nothing back, because none of it was a secret and all of it could be used. On the last morning, he closed the notebook and set it on the table between them. I have built 61 houses in this county, he said. The next house I build will be the first. Hollis looked at the notebook, then at him. Build it for the foreman's son, she said, the boy who lived. Build it into the south slope of the rise at the head of the section road, where the wind comes off the river but the slope will break it. The bedrock there is shale. It will hold a foundation if you set the piers deep. That boy will need a home that does not have to argue with the country he was born into. Webb looked at her for a long moment. He picked up the notebook, put it back inside his coat, and walked out. He built the house that spring. The county held the land in trust. The pastor of the smaller church administered the funds Mott had provided. And the boy grew up in the house that Webb built on the south-facing slope, raised by the Webb family, who had not had a son past Eli and were glad of one more. In the years that followed, the town of Endeavor rebuilt itself differently. Not all at once, not with any formal agreement, but the winter of 1884 had a way of making certain arguments permanently unavailable. And the people who had lived through it, who had followed cedar stakes in the dark, who had heard a brass bell through 45 below zero air, and walked toward it, who had slept on limestone at 53 degrees, while the world above the rock tried to end those people built differently when they built again. Silas Webb built 6 new houses in the county over the next 2 years. He set them all on bedrock with double walls packed with wool, with chimneys routed through stone features, with root cellars that used the earth's own temperature. He stopped calling himself the most respected builder in the county. He started calling himself a student of the ground. Lyndon Marsh apprenticed under Webb at 14 and worked as a builder in 3 Dakota counties for 50 years. He kept the folding rule Hollis had given him in his hip pocket until the day they buried him in 1946. His children tried to take it out for safekeeping before the service, and he told them with the particular firmness of a man who has been making his position clear on this subject for decades to leave it where it was. Eli Webb drafted the building code that the Dakota Territory by then a state adopted in 1906 for unincorporated counties. The code required winter wind orientation, dual venting, and food storage standards for every newly homesteaded dwelling. It was adopted because it was sensible and because the man who wrote it had grown up watching what happened to buildings that did not follow its principles. He gave Hollis Vane no credit in the official record because she had instructed him not to. Put it in the code, she told him when she was 71. Names die, codes don't. Aldrich Pell resigned as mayor in March of 1884, citing health. He moved the following year to Council Bluffs to live with a married daughter. Every Christmas until his death in 1891, he sent Hollis a short letter and a small parcel of pressed apples from his daughter's orchard. The letters never said much. The first one said the only thing that needed saying. The bottomland sold after 1872 is included in the land office's permanent record now, with the date of that winter in red ink. I have asked that it remain so. Cyrus Mott never recovered the financial ground he had stood on in the summer of 1883. He sat at 16 kitchen tables over the course of that spring and said without his hat what he had said at the cave mouth on the 8th evening. He sold what remained of his herd to service the Yankton debt and moved to a small place west of the river with a modest number of cattle and no credit of any kind extended by any bank. He died 14 years later with 9 head and no debts. Those who knew him in those later years said he was a different kind of man than the one who had ridden a silver-saddled stallion to the foot of a limestone cliff to laugh at a woman with a shovel. He did not disagree with that assessment. Verity Finch kept teaching. She no longer used Vane's folly as a moral example, not because she had abandoned her belief in progress, but because she had come to understand that progress looked different depending on whether you were measuring it by what you moved away from or by what you carried forward. She brought her older students to the cave every autumn 1 Saturday a month to learn about temperature and stone and the breath of the earth. She brought them to see the spring niche and the diverter and the fissure cap, and she described each one with the same precision she brought to arithmetic because they were the same thing, a problem that required careful thought and then careful action in that order. Hollis Vane died in the cabin at the back of the cave in November of 1921. She was 70 years old. Asa held her hand. Outside, the sage was the silver color it goes in late autumn, and the thermometer on the cliff face read 42 degrees, and inside the cave the air held at 53, as it had always held. The cedar trunk was 3 feet from the bed. The bird was inside it wrapped in its square of apron cloth, the nail-burned eye still watchful. She had taken it out twice a year for 60 years, once in February and once in summer, and set it on whatever table was nearest, and looked at it for a few minutes and put it back. In the last few years, Asa had sometimes sat across from her while she looked at it, and they had not talked about it, and that had been exactly right. The gelding had been gone for 40 years, buried at the foot of the cliff under a fieldstone marker she had carved herself. The bell still hung on its iron hook at the cave mouth. The lantern nesh was still there, cut into the limestone at shoulder height, where the wind could not reach it. She had built what she set out to build. She had fed the people she did not yet know she was feeding. She had lit the lantern before anyone was coming, and hung the bell before there was anyone to hear it, and driven the stakes before there was a storm to make them necessary. The work had been right. The work had been enough. Asa lived 9 more years in the cabin after she died. He was a man who had built things to last and saw no reason to leave them. His daughter wrote often asking him to come west to where she lived, and he wrote back that he was comfortable and had everything he needed, which was true. He died in 1930 in the bed he had built himself in 1883, in the cabin he had framed with his own hands against the back wall of a cave that people had laughed at and then slept in and then were glad of. They buried him beside her on the bluff above the cave mouth in sight of the line of cedar stakes that the county had replaced twice over the years, maintaining them, because the path they marked had been walked often enough that the walking itself had become a kind of argument for the stake's necessity. In 1952, in the second week of June, the South Dakota State Historical Society installed a bronze plaque in the limestone wall to the right of the cabin door. The man who unveiled it was 76 years old. He had been carried out of the snow as an infant in Hollis Vane's arms, laid in the arms of Webb's wife in the cave, and had grown up in the house that Silas Webb built on the south-facing slope at the head of the section road. He had become a builder like his father by trade, and like the woman who had saved him by philosophy. And he had built in 9 states, and every one of the buildings he had put up in those 9 states sat on bedrock or into a hillside or with its back to the prevailing wind, because he had grown up in a house that taught him what those choices meant. He read the plaque aloud, his voice carrying over the small crowd gathered in the bright June air. The Vane Cave, built 1883 by Hollis and Asa Vane against the laughter of a town, endured the storm of February 1884, when the rest of Endeavor did not. Sheltered 24 souls. Stands at 53 degrees year-round as it stood then. The wise do not fight the country. They listen to it, respect it, and build with it. He read the last line twice. Then he stepped forward and placed his open hand flat against the limestone beside the plaque. He held it there for a moment, the way a man holds his hand against stone when he wants to feel what the stone is, what it has always been, what it will continue to be long after the hand is gone. The stone was 53 degrees. It had always been 53 degrees. It would always be. He stepped back. The cave stood in this June sunlight with its wide south-facing mouth open to the morning, breathing out its constant cool air, the way it had breathed since before there were people on this continent to stand in it and feel it on their faces. The bell hung on its iron hook just inside the entrance. The lantern niche was empty now in daylight, but the hook inside it where the lantern had hung was still worn smooth from decades of use. On summer field trips, children were allowed to ring the bell one at a time carefully, and they did, and the sound it made in the limestone air was the same sound it had made on 7 nights in February of 1884, when a boy named Lyndon Marsh had stood at the cave mouth in the wind and rung it every 15 minutes into the white dark keeping count. Keeping faith, doing the thing he had been asked to do for people he could not see but knew were out there. The bell rang. The sound carried. That was all it needed to do.